So I wish to discuss three theoretically difficult questions. The first question is, under what circumstances states are allowed to demand their citizens to die for them in war? The second question is, under what circumstances states are allowed to demand their citizens to kill enemy soldiers in war? The third question is, under what circumstances citizens are entitled to refuse to die and kill in war, to become refuseniks? These questions are not only theoretically difficult, they are also of great practical importance, for they deal with matters of life and death. The responses provided to these questions in modern Western thought are premised on the secular humanist tradition. The core claim of secular humanism is that our supreme concern as human beings should be with the welfare and flourishing of humans. Secular humanism denies the existence of God. Therefore, it objects to the reliance of human beings on God for solving their problems and for making their lives better. Rather, it expects human beings to take responsibility over their lives. As secular humanism denies the existence of God, it is non-creationist. It assumes that the world has been formed in lengthy chemical biological processes and that the human race is the outcome of a long evolutionary process. Secular humanism holds that every living organism, including the human body, ends up its life in death, and that following death of the body, the human mind ceases to exist. Likewise, it denies the existence of afterlife, as well as reincarnation, namely the possibility that following death of the body, the human mind will inhabit another body. Secular humanism expects human beings to face the fact of their finality. In line with secular humanism, the modern Western response to the first question, the question under what circumstances states are allowed to demand their citizens to die for them in war, the first question is provided by the social contract tradition of political theory. In the writings of Hobbes, Locke, Rousseau, Kant, and Rawls, one finds that the only circumstances in which a state may demand its citizens to die for it in war are those of self-defense war. But the question arises, when we talk about self-defense, who is the self that is entitled to defend itself in war? For Hobbes and Locke, the self is the individual human being. Their analysis implicitly assumes that the outcome of war is genocide, the extermination of the citizens of a state. But starting with Rousseau, and in Kant and Rawls, there's a wider understanding of the possible outcomes of war. War may not only end up in the extermination of individual human beings, but also in the annihilation of their political independence, in the extermination of their culture following enemy occupation, and in ethnic cleansing, that is to say, disassociation of people from their territory and culture. The answer to the second question, under what circumstances states are allowed to demand their citizens to kill enemy soldiers in war, is provided by ethics, or to be more specific, by the ethics of warfare. The majority of scholars of the ethics of warfare hold that the answer to the question when is killing in war allowed depends on the question whether a soldier participates in a just war or not, namely, whether the war a soldier participates in is a war of self-defense or a war of aggression. According to the majority of scholars of the ethics of warfare, only in a war of self-defense is a soldier entitled to kill, whereas in a war of aggression, he or she need to relinquish the use of arms and to refuse to fight. However, there's a minority position among ethics of warfare scholars according to which a soldier is entitled to kill in any war, whether it is a war of self-defense or a war of aggression. The answer to the third question, under what circumstances citizens are entitled to refuse to die and kill in a war, to be a refusnik, is provided by the law. The distinction applied by liberal law is one formulated most recently by John Rawls in the theory of justice, namely the distinction between civil disobedience and conscientious objection. Civil disobedience is perceived as a form of public political action, and in cases of this type, the state is regarded as entitled to criminally penalize protesting citizens who refuse to join the army. In contrast, conscientious objection is viewed as a personal, subjective measure, and it is usually held that in those fairly narrow circumstances in which conscientious objection is recognized, soldiers should be exempt from military service and released without penalty. I noted that modern political theory, namely the social contract tradition, the ethics of warfare, and Western liberal law are all premised on the secular humanist tradition. However, in any Western country, there live people who do not exclusively abide by the premises of this tradition, the secular humanist tradition. Religious people, for example, have very different notions as to the meaning of death and as to what may justify death. In Judaism, for example, there's a strong current of thought that believes in the existence of afterlife, namely in the view that life does not cease with the death of the body. In addition, under Judaism, the circumstances that may justify death are wider than those of self-defense. Under Judaism, a person should lose her life not only for the purposes of self-defense, but also when she is required to commit acts amounting to bloodshed, idolatry, and incest. Moreover, religious people living in Israel hold that the state may demand its soldiers to die in wars that go beyond self-defense, namely wars that are meant to accomplish national, religious, territorial goals. However, the true problem lies elsewhere, namely, in the case of Israel, it has to do with the secular liberal citizens of the state. The continuous occupation of the West Bank is the outcome of a great historical decision of Israel's right-wing governments that the major goal of Jewish nationalism, Zionism, in the decades following the Six-Day War of 1967 has not been the achievement of peace with the Palestinian people, but rather the perpetuation of the occupation of the West Bank and the deepening and widening of the settlement project under the occupation's auspices. This great historical decision was to some extent motivated by religious sentiments. What this means, therefore, is that when secular, liberal Israeli soldiers are required to serve in the occupied territories, they have to do so, at least in part, for religious motivations that they do not share. Moreover, and this is my main point, much of what goes on in the occupied territories is initiated by a small group of religious zealots who live in the territories. In the 1970s and 1980s, these were members of the Bloc of the Faithful, Gush Emunim, movement. Profoundly influenced by the messianic theology of Rabbi Abraham Yitzchak Cohen Cook and his son, Rabbi Tzvi Yehuda Cohen Cook, members of this movement, Gush Emunim, forced the government to establish a series of settlements in the occupied territories in spots that were way beyond the settlement policies of the governments. It is hard to exaggerate the influence of Gush Emunim on the future fate of Israel and the territories, wrote renowned Jerusalemite historian Yoshua Arieli in 1987. And sociologist Uri Ben Eliezer writes on the establishment of Gush Emunim, writes on the establishment by Gush Emunim of its first settlement in Sebastia in 1975 that it was probably the most important event in the history of Israel in the last 50 years. for it signaled the turning point after which the possibility of a two-state solution diminished. Since the 1990s, the messianic theology of the Kook rabbis, the Father and the Son, was taken over by another group of religious zealots, Youth of the Hills, known in Hebrew as Noar HaGvaot. This group abides by a specific interpretation of the Kook theology, according to which the land of Israel is holy, the Jewish people is holy, and when non-Jews live in the land of Israel, they contaminate it. The final logic of this interpretation is therefore what is known in Israeli parlance as transfer, namely expulsion and deportation of the Palestinian inhabitants of the occupied territories to Jordan, and it is therefore the daily conduct of those belonging to the Youth of the Hills movement to make life unbearable for the Palestinians living in the occupied territories by employing against them numerous means of violence, harassment, and expulsion, all with the support of the IDF and the police. And this is a crucial point. It's all done with the support of the Israel Defense Forces. Needless to say, the political implications of such a theology and conduct are nothing short of horrific. And here is my point. It should have not necessarily been the case that secular Israeli governments themselves adhere to the messianic theology of the Kook rabbis. Rather, it has been enough that groups of extreme settlers who live in the occupied territories, groups such as Gush Emunim and Youth of the Hills, have followed this theology and have taken measures for its implementation. Once this has been done, these settlers have dictated to the Israeli governments much of what has transpired in the occupied territories since the 1970s, or to put it differently, they've dictated to the government and to the Israeli military, the IDF, the agenda of their activities in the occupied territories. From a broader perspective, it may be argued that the conduct of Gush Emunim and then the conduct of Youth of the Hills have determined much of the level of past, present, and future violence and bloodshed for both Palestinians and Israelis at large. A similar case is that of the movement known as the Temple Mount Trustees, Ne'emanei Har HaBayit. In recent decades, a striking, unprecedented theological turn has taken place in Judaism with regard to this site, the Temple Mount. For many centuries, it was self-evident in Judaism that climbing the Temple Mount was strictly forbidden for the fear of contaminating Judaism's most sacred site. However, in recent decades, a new opposite theology arose, according to which Jews are not only allowed to climb the Temple Mount, rather it is an important religious imperative, a mitzvah, to do so. The result is that every year, thousands of Jews crowded the Temple Mounts. One of the peaks of this trend took place this past Passover just 2 months ago, when hundreds of religious Jews aimed at conducting on the Temple Mount the Passover sacrifice of young lambs. The problem, however, is that the Temple Mount is also the site of El Haram HaSharif, and in it, the El Aqsa Mosque, the third holiest site for Muslims in the world. As a result, many occasions in which Jews climb the Temple Mount result in riots initiated by Muslims, and these riots, often spreading to the occupied territories and even to Israel itself, end up in casualties, both Palestinian and Jewish. For example, in October 1990, riots ensued following an attempt made by Jewish zealots to begin works for the construction of the Third Temple, and 17 Palestinians lost their lives. Indeed, it has been noted numerous times that Jewish attempts to climb the Temple Mount and lay on it the foundations for the Third Temple are the most explosive measure that can be invoked in the Middle East. So explosive that it can spark a total war between Jews and Muslims, in the region and even beyond. And as in the case of the Youth of the Hills, Noar HaGvaot, it is a small group of religious zealots that dictate the events for the governments, for Jewish Israelis, for Israeli Arabs, and for the Palestinians inhabiting the occupied territories. What does all of that mean for secular, liberal Israeli conscientious objectors? As I noted earlier, these objectors draw on their personal morality and claim that their conscience, their inner morality, does not allow them to take part in the activities of the IDF in the occupied territories. However, I wish to suggest that Israeli secular, liberal, selective refuseniks, those who are not pacifists but refuse to take part in the activities of the IDF taking place in the occupied territories. So I want to suggest that Israeli secular, liberal, selective refuseniks need to opt for another category in asking for exemption from military service in the occupied territories that goes beyond civil disobedience and conscientious objection. They should opt for what I call culture-based refusal. That is to say, they should argue that when they are asked to serve in the occupied territories, they face cultural coercion, namely that they are subordinated to state imperatives emanating from a culture that is not theirs, a religious messianic culture. Put differently, Israeli secular, liberal refuseniks should claim that they are entitled to the protection of the number one doctrine that liberal multicultural states employ in dealing with the practices and convictions of non-liberal cultural minorities residing in their territories, namely the liberal doctrine of toleration, according to which, in some circumstances, power holders are supposed to refrain from utilizing the power that is at their disposal against conducts that they deem deplorable. I mean, in every liberal country, we have non-liberal minorities living in the territory of the state. And many of their practices are repugnant to basic values of liberalism. They discriminate women, they marry their daughters at the age of 14, they committed all kind of mutilation of females, etc., etc. And still, in most cases, liberal states tolerate these practices that are clearly repugnant to basic liberal values. Why do they do that? Because they resort to the liberal doctrine of toleration, which says that sometimes you don't employ your power against practices that you deem to be offensive because you have higher values, higher consideration that restrain you from resorting to your power. And in these cases of non-liberal minorities living in liberal countries, the supreme value is the identity between human beings and their culture, the respect we have for cultures, including minority cultures. So because of this high value of culture, and because we identify the culture of human beings with their subjective minds, we hold our power and tolerate, and here enters the doctrine, the liberal doctrine of toleration. We tolerate these terrible practices sometimes and do not employ the power of the state against such repugnant practices. So my claim is that the theory, the doctrine, the liberal doctrine of toleration should be employed by refuseniks claiming that they belong to a culture that should be tolerated, a culture that differs from the culture that motivates much of what takes place in the occupied territories, much of what has been taking place in the occupied territories since the mid-1970s. What all of this attests to is the singularity of Israel's multicultural situation and the fact that though Israel tends to portray itself as a liberal state, what really governs matters of life and death in Israel is not liberal democratic principles and practices, those emanating from the secular humanist tradition and the social contract tradition, but notions and practices borrowed from a specific extreme messianic Jewish theology. That is the name of the game in the territories, and it has been the name of the game there since the rise of Gush Emunim, and now it's being followed for the past 3 decades by Noar HaGvaot. I conclude. John Maynard Keynes famously wrote in the General Theory of Employment, Interest, and Money, published in 1935, that the ideas of economists and political philosophers are more powerful than is commonly understood. Indeed, the world is ruled by little else, the ideas of economists and political philosophers. The power of vested interests is vastly exaggerated compared with the gradual encroachment of ideas. Thus wrote John Maynard Keynes in 1935. In Israel, it is the messianic theological ideas of 2 rabbis, a father and a son, one writing in the early decades of the 20th century and the other in the 1970s, that determine much of the issues of life and death of soldiers of the IDF serving in the occupied territories. Since this is the case, it is my argument the secular soldiers called upon to serve in the occupied territories should enjoy the benefit of a doctrine of culture-based refusal sanctioned by the liberal doctrine of toleration. Thank you.